So the big question here is, when do we want to use the previous frame to keep our initial capture at 30? We can read the information from the previous frame to say, all right, go ahead and just roll with that number, and that will allow us to make that value stick. So in my head, I think of it like this. If a point is out here, the start frame is equal to 0. Start frame equals 0. So we don't want to look at the previous frame if the start frame is equal to 0. The logic that we can say for that is, if start frame does not equal 0, in other words, looks like start frame has changed, we're down here, that's the only time we want to consider reading anything from the previous frame. So let's build that in real quick. Point wrangle, plug that into input 2. We'll say if start frame does not equal 0. That's the only time you are willing to do anything over here on this second input. Now, what's going to happen if this point is green? If the start frame is not the value of 0, well, it's going to look at the previous frame. So to do that, we need to use the points expression right here. Look through index number 1. We're trying to read start frame, and we'll use the point number to identify which point it needs to read. So if we think this through, what's going to happen is that on frame 30, and let's actually just try to play this out in our heads a tad bit here. So particle comes down on frame 30, it hits. What's the logic look like right now? Well, we're going to capture this start frame on 30. It says, all right, you're green now. Mark down 30. And what's this guy going to say? This guy's going to say, okay, so if start frame does not equal 0, aha, it's not 0 because it just wrote down 30. Now I need to look through this input to read the previous frame. But uh-oh, what was that previous frame? 0. The start frame hasn't really been recorded yet. And so because of this, it's not going to work yet. We need to also recognize what the previous frame was. Because if the previous frame was 0, then we need to tell this guy that it can't operate, right? This situation only happens once, where the previous frame is 0 and then the next frame is 30. That's when things initially get recorded. And so in our logic, we can identify what the previous start frame value was and build that into our conditional statement right here. Let me just show you what that looks like real fast. First of all, let's try to read what the previous frame start frame value is. The fact that this is called start frame makes it kind of confusing. But we'll create a float variable, previous frame is equal to, let's go through input number 2, that's index 1. Look for start frame and use the point number. Okay, so again, we're reading what that start frame is supposed to be. We're saying, okay, now we recognize that this old previous frame is 0. So now in our conditional statement, we can also say, and the previous frame does not equal 0. Then you can go ahead and use that. So let's do a rundown one more time just to try to get an idea of what's happening here. Okay, the point comes down. It's frame 30. Aha, we capture it. But according to our initial statements, the problem is that now this guy is going to recognize that it needs to read the previous frame. What was the previous frame? The previous frame was a value of 0, so the 30 never gets captured. How do we find our way around it? Well, we first of all identify the points from the previous frame, and we see that the start value, or the start frame, has a value of 0. Okay, in that situation, this should not be allowed to work so that the 30 is captured. Now, what happens on frame 31? Frame 31 comes around. This guy says, okay, you're 31 now. But now, according to our conditional statements, we look at the previous frame value. What was the previous start frame value? Uh-oh, it was 30. Now this guy kicks into action, and we start reading the previous frame, keeping our value at 30. Hopefully that makes sense. It's, like I said, a little bit complicated. I took a few minutes to think about that one. So don't think that this is obvious by any means. It's kind of a mind game here. But hopefully that is the best way I can explain what is happening. Oh, and I forgot to say that we want to set start frame to this whole expression right here. There we go. So now that we have that, we go to our solver, geo spreadsheet. Particle comes down, frame 30, we capture it. It stays at 30. And likewise for everything else. Last but not least, what happens when we put this in the pyro burst source? It's going to actually do an explosion at frame 1. And we'll fix that here in a minute. But at frame 30, it hits, and then likewise for all of the other missiles, like so. All right, that about does it for now. For caching this out, let's go ahead and just cache out the particles. I'm going to clean up some of the attributes that we don't need. So let's just go ahead and remove all attributes except for ID, except for start frame. And I believe we also need the hit normal, which is right there, hit normal. That preserves the normal of the surface that it hit. So we'll also keep hit normal. And if we need anything else from there, we can always go back and change that. But for right now, this will do just fine. We can file cache this out. And in the next video, let's move on to something else.